Well, we might make a start, and I'll sit on the back, just letting anybody in as they come in. I'd like to say welcome, Joe. Lovely to have you talking to us tonight. Look forward to what you've got to say, and yeah, as always, we'll have opportunity for questions at the end, I imagine, unless you're going to have any questions as you're running through. That's really up to you. But yeah, look forward to what you've got to say. So take it away, Joe.
Great, thanks, David. Thank you for inviting me and allowing me to present this material. I think some of you will be more familiar with some of the things that I'll be saying tonight, and others won't be. So we'll have some time for questions at the end, I hope. And we've got a fair bit to get through, so I'll get started right away. I chose this topic because it often comes up in discussions, like what makes something sacred. And there is a lot of things that we can say about it, but before we do, I thought I'd just start with a little quiz to begin with. So if we just casually think about the topic of something being sacred, we all have our opinions and understanding based on the dictionary and our experience of things in life. So something like this, for example, what is sacredness? What is sacred? So is this meal, for example, sacred? And the question I'd be wanting to ask yourself is why? You know, what makes it so? Is it because it's delicious or appealing, or is it just considered a mundane thing, even though it's nice and pleasant? Versus this meal, is this meal sacred? And what makes it so? It's a meal as well. Is it because of what is being revealed here? Is this animal sacred? Are animals sacred? And I'd again be asking you why, or why not? What about this one? Some people consider this a sacred animal. Is that simply by convention, that somebody has decided to agree that certain animals are more sacred than others? So there are many reasons why we might consider things sacred. What about this one, this piece of art? This is from Marcel Duchamp, called The Ready-Mades, in which he was actually poking fun at art and saying, well, I could do anything and put it in a museum and it'll be considered art. And it turned out to be the beginning of a whole new genre. He even signed it as a joke. Is that considered sacred? No, well, I wouldn't think so. I'd be surprised if anybody says it is. But art does sort of lift something out of the ordinary. The fact that it's considered to be a work of art is already lifting something out of the threshold of ordinary experience. What about this work of art? Is that sacred? Why? Why not? I'd say it is sacred because I painted it, so that was a self-definition. I'm engaged in a course of sacred Islamic art and geometry, which is actually quite an interesting study in itself. Yes. What about this sculpture? This is by a famous artist called Jeff Koons, who makes a lot of money from his art, and he does these balloony kind of things. It's actually made of metal, I believe, but he makes them into the shape of these balloons. And he calls this one Balloon Venus L'Espugne. And it was sold in 3 years ago in 2020 for $8 million US. So if you want to make money, art's the way to go, I'd say, or at least being an art dealer, not necessarily an art maker. But Jeff Koons is one of the more successful ones who's raked it in. That's
Joe,
of course based.
Exactly.
That's of course based on this very early piece of art, or artifact rather. That's about 25,000 to 30,000 years old, and it's called the Venus of Willendorf, because Willendorf is the place where they found this buried. And it was quite a popular form of sculpture in those days, a very early form of sculpture, in which people would carry around this type of image of a woman with exaggerated features, accentuated features perhaps, to highlight certain aspects that they wanted to be reminded of. And it's got a non-distinct face, and there's been a lot of musings about this. I would say that based on what we know from Swedenborg about correspondences, that there are some correspondences in here which people were reminding themselves of with this kind of form. But that's another discussion. Really, the question here is quite simple. What makes it sacred if you consider it sacred? Is it because it reminded them of divine providence and of God? That's quite possible. What about this string of pearls? Is that sacred? It's these days considered simply a beautification decoration piece. It might be quite expensive. That might make it sacred for some. But in itself, I guess it's not considered a sacred artifact. And what about this string of beads? It's probably costs a lot less, but it may be worth a lot more in terms of how it's used. So would it be sacred because of its function, its context of use?
Of course.
Context, definitely. What about this activity? Is that sacred? I'd say probably not. What about this? I call that swooning, which may be an unfair description of it, but is it considered sacred by some people because it expresses a certain feeling, and that feeling is considered sacred because of the context, again, of where it's felt. You might do this in a theatre where a pop artist is doing something on the stage, or you might do this in a church where something is being expressed through music or prayer or something like that. What about this one? Is this person sacred? Well, of course, you could bend it any which way, really. You could say yes, of course, but the function that the person's carrying out isn't particularly sacred. It's not particularly something special, lifted up out of ordinary life. Whereas you might say that someone like this is a person who has a role that would put them more into the category of being sacred. Let's have a look.
Yeah, it's our video is frozen, unfortunately. Oh, here we go. Joe, you're muted if you can hear us.
Unmute, yes. Maybe I should hide this screen because it's not very relevant to the presentation. How can I do that? Just a sec. Here we go. This is what we're up to. So we're just going through a couple of examples to test your thought processes and your ideas about what sacredness is, without going into much of an explanation at first. What about this? Is this a sacred work of art? Is it even a work of art? Or is it a work of rebellion? Is it rebelling against something? I mean, it's not a bad piece of graffiti for what it is, but and it certainly calls attention to something. But is it sacred? Well, it's debatable, isn't it? What about this work of art? Botticelli, painted in about 1470. This is called the Primavera, which is about the spring, and it depicts a mythological scene where God's influence, which is characterized by the zephyr on the right-hand side of the picture of the screen, is encouraging a person whose nature is still quite outward. She's looking back and looking towards that side. She's speaking something from which greenery flows, flowers, a garland of flowers. But she's not wearing it. So she's kind of able to speak the teachings or the truths, but in the next person, she's actually wearing it. So that's supposedly the same person, called Chlora. And Chlora, of course, is to do with greenery and nature, but it's human nature as well. So it's come into a new state by the time you get to the third figure there, because what was originally spoken is now embodied. So it's more part of the person. Then you've got a rather pregnant-looking Madonna in the middle, which you could say is a continuity of that same sequence. And she's surrounded by a sort of halo of light. And above her, you've got Cupid, who's blind, divine love. Blind in the sense that love without wisdom, of course, cannot achieve anything by itself. And it's shooting an arrow through the midst of those three muses to the left. And they're expressing their delight in a harmonious company. So they're sort of building community, if you like, and together they're achieving something. And then at the very far left, you've got the god Mercury, who is poking his caduceus wand through the clouds of obscurity to obtain a knowledge of what is beyond the hidden veil. And you can see that the trees have oranges growing in them, and the flowers are growing in the bottom there. So it's very meticulously painted, very carefully constructed. The oranges don't grow until you get past the first two figures, and the flowers start to change their species as you go through the picture as well. All of that is part of the design of a vignette that shows the stages of reformation and regeneration. So it's a depiction of something quite profound, something quite important. So I guess that would be more likely to be classified as something sacred, as opposed to, say, something like this, which is an expression of an individual on a wall. Probably just momentarily designed without too much of a theme in it, maybe a bit of fun in there. I
think that's his.
Yourself in the shower. Okay, you might say, well, it's useful, but is it sacred? Well, perhaps not. However, if we look at this,
I think that
look at this version of the same thing.
Where's the pastor speaking? What's in this thing?
Okay, so is it considered sacred because of who's doing it? The fact that it symbolizes something, it may not be a necessity to wash that person's feet, but it's an act that demonstrates a teaching. So it's the Pope washing a few people's feet from Africa, a few migrants, I think. Here's another one. Is this person sacred? Particularly? Maybe, maybe not. It's producing music which makes people feel pleasant or pleased and happy. Here's another one. This is Riley Lee, who is an Australian-based shakuhachi Grand Master. He was actually the first person to attain that rank outside of Japan. So he's quite knowledgeable and gifted and experienced in that particular art. And his lineage descends from the Zen Buddhist priests of nothingness from the Edo period, which is 1600s. So he's not just playing music for the sake of making some enjoyable sounds and passing the time and building a skill. He's actually also using this as a Buddhist meditation, which is a focus on a spiritual something. So there's something else going on here other than just the music itself. He performed in the Roseville New Church a number of occasions. He loves the church for its acoustics and its energy, and I'm sure he'll be back again soon. What about buildings? Would this be a sacred building?
It could be.
It could be. It could be the shack of some mystic, maybe a Russian starret. Is it starret, what they're called?
Starret.
Yeah. But it could just be a shack. As opposed to this, which is very obviously because of its use and where it is. It's in Jerusalem. What's its function? That might give you a clue. And so there are lots of things there which may influence your decision whether you would consider that sacred or not. All right, just a couple more. What about this one? Is this image sacred? That is actually shit, a ball of shit.
Yeah.
It's called a dung beetle. They have this habit of rolling dung into a ball and then burying it, rolling it back on their hind legs, pushing it back behind themselves on their hind legs into their nest, so that their eggs and then later on their offspring can have something to feed on when they first come out. Well, you might say, no, that's not sacred. It has to do with poo. It has to do, but if you didn't have dung beetles and beetles very much like this, we'd actually be up to our ears in manure. So consider the fact that it's a good piece of design to have these things around. They do process a lot of biological matter that otherwise we'd be stuck with. However, there were people who saw something in this, and that was the Egyptians. This is actually the Egyptian symbol for regeneration, rebirth, and that was that same scarab beetle, because at noon they have this certain behavior of flying up towards the sun right in the middle of the day. And that was seen as a correspondence or a spiritual symbol of a reverence for the sun. And the sun in itself also is a correspondence or a symbol of the creator. And so it's a kind of worshipful state. And so you have this beetle chasing the sun in the same way that the natural biological beetle was chasing a beautiful round ball of dung. What about this? Is this image sacred? Sun rising in between two hills. Yes, well, I guess you could say it's a nice image. It gives me a wonderful feeling. It reminds me of lots of spiritual things, and that in itself may be good. But you wouldn't normally consider this in itself sacred. However, there is a culture, again, the Egyptians, who saw this as a reason to symbolize it in this way, because, again, it is a correspondence or a spiritual symbol for the physical sun's relationship to the spiritual sun. Now, that embodies a whole teaching that there is a spiritual sun in existence, and this spiritual sun actually feeds the physical sun or maintains the physical sun, as this depiction actually indicates. You've got lots of rays of connection, of influence between the two suns, one at the top, one at the bottom. And you've got the sun coming up between the two hills over the horizon. So this is the sun rising over a circular mound of creation. That's the creation mound. As goddesses pour out the primeval waters around it. So it's quite an old and highly symbolic religious statement for the Egyptians. All right, so enough of the quiz. Let's have a look at the definition of the word sacred. So it's good to have a definition, which is, wait, can you see this? Because my screen is telling me that it's not sharing it.
Yes, we can see.
You can see the dictionary?
Yep.
Oh, okay. I don't know, for some reason my screen has decided to put a different color around it. All right, that's fine. Let me just reshare that because I think it's having troubles.
It's fine at our end.
Yeah, I can't now see it, so that's a bit of a problem. Sorry about this. Let me just try again.
That's okay.
Here we go. Back to my Zoom session. What's happening here? What's happening here? Everything's playing up. No, very good. Okay. Zoom.
I'm listening.
Here we are. Let's see if this works. There. Okay. That's looking better. Can you see that again?
Okay. All good.
Yeah. All right. So the word sacred is a Latin word that which is consecrated. Consecrated is to make something sacred, to make or declare something sacred. As you can see down the bottom, to make something holy or to devote. Consecrated also means to make or declare sacred by certain ceremonies or rites. Okay, so saker is that which is consecrated, something that's consecrated, dedicated, purified, set apart. That's an important definition, or made holy. So what's holy mean? Holy is something that's sacred, pure. It comes from the Middle English whole, which is now spelled whole with the suffix y. It's associated with the Latin word sanctus, and that has a pre-Christian meaning, whole or intact. In other words, can't be transgressed or violated. So it's got a sense of protecting it, making sure that it remains protected. So you wouldn't do that unless something's important, right? You don't hang on to something unless you think it's going to be of use and provide you with some value. It comes from the Old English Heil, the Old High German Heil, which means health, happiness, and good luck. And the Proto-Indo-European root word is kailo, which means whole or uninjured. And that again is related to health. So you can see that health is very closely related to holy, and holy is associated with sacredness. So that gives you a bit of a clue. So we have ways of depicting holiness or sacredness, such as showing saintly individuals like the apostles here with a sort of shining disc around their heads. And Swedenborg explains that that's, how people used to be seen in the spiritual world. They radiate from their head.
No.
So it's a kind of a commemoration of that idea, a continuation of that idea in its depiction. We have ways of behaving around sacred places and processes, such as leaving our shoes outside. So the most natural thing that has touched the earth and probably dirty, because that's what shoes do, is they protect our feet from getting too dirty and sore and affected by the ground. So we leave the shoes outside when we go inside a sacred place, like a temple in some countries. So sacred is the profane. So that which is profane comes from Latin profanus, which means outside the temple, something that's not sacred, from Latin pro, meaning before, and funum, temple. So that sort of sets it aside from things that are not included in the temple. Now, a temple is a conventional place to worship. It's sort of a reminder for us, right? Now, an interesting thing to follow up here is the meaning of the word sacred in one of the earliest language recorded is what it means in the Egyptian. So these, the hieroglyphs are on the bottom right, and hieroglyphs in themselves mean sacred marks or sacred letters, sacred writing. This is the word sacred, DSR. We don't actually know how they pronounce the vowels because they only wrote down the consonants, as with a lot of early languages, particularly around the Middle East. And this represents the primary Egyptian word for the meaning holy or sacred. It's one of the oldest words in Egyptian language, and Swedenborg tells us that the Egyptians had quite a profound spiritual knowledge, and they knew about correspondences, so spiritual significations, spiritual symbolism, spiritual connections between natural things and spiritual. It's worth noting what the Egyptians say about this word. And the earliest meaning is at the top. So waving motion, brandish, and wield is the earliest meaning of holy and sacred, that word, Cheshire. And then it goes all the way down to a meaning of something holy, like a thing that's holy, the temple, necropolis, or sacred object. But in between, we've got a bit of migration of meaning or expansion of meaning, meaning from the original meaning of waving motion, brandishing, or wielding, which is a bit like a sword, right? You can imagine you're brandishing a sword. What would you do that for? You would do that to protect something, right? So it has the sense of protection, to ward off, or to clear is to get rid of things that don't belong, or to keep things away that are threatening the integrity of what you're protecting. Then you've got the meaning that crops up of to separate. So how do we keep something that we're trying to protect apart from other things? Well, by distinguishing it, by making distinctions and seeing that this is not the same as that. And then we have the sense of segregated, which is applies mainly to the land, or necropolis, for example. The necropolis is set apart from the town, the village, the city. And it usually is, in Egyptian times, was located in the west. So the worshipful symbols and places were in the east, and the burial places in the west. Then you have seclusions. Then you have the idea of sacred space, and sacred. Then, of course, from sacred space, you quite quickly go from sacred space to sacred things, and then eventually the meaning of holy. So that symbol on the bottom right in the hieroglyph is a set of arms holding a spear. So that's a kind of the earliest idea. And lips represent something that you might say. And the other symbols are a fold of cloth and a serpent. A serpent often represents natural things, sort of sensual things. Okay, we've got a similar sort of idea of brandishing and wielding a sword, a protective device, which is from the Garden of Eden, when the story of the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve were enjoying a paradisical state or place, and they were instructed to behave in a certain way, but they were left free to make up their own mind about what they wanted to do, and they decided to go against the advice, or they were persuaded against the advice to do what was for them. They were expelled from the Garden of Eden. So that paradisical state kind of left them because they had decided that of the two trees in the Garden of Eden, that they were going to eat from the second tree, not the tree of life, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what that represents is a story that says that there are two ways in which we can orient ourselves towards life. One is to accept things as they really are, which is the tree of life and what the tree of life represents, and to live according to that. The other is to be taken by the fruits of that, of the things that we know, see, and can work with, and to take joy and delight in dealing with things appeal to how it's been created. Once we do that, we're on a whole different path. So the pleasures of providence are not quite as sweet anymore, because we've decided to take it into our own hands, and therefore we also have to face the problems of how to make sense of things, and how to use things, and how to stop ourselves from getting lost and stuck. And that's kind of the story of this talk, in a way. So a couple of quotes from Swedenborg relating to this is that he says in his major work Arcana Celestia 4180 that divine truth brings fear, dread and terror to people who lack goodness. Divine goodness does not bring fear, dread and terror to people, because divine good frightens no one. But divine truth is what terrifies people, not divine goodness. And his explanation elsewhere is that our sensory capacity turned away from the heavenly side. The Lord was to come into the world to reunite the sensory and the heavenly. Because the outer self turned away, conflict arose, resulting in misery, damnation, and in the end, hell. These consequences followed one another in the history of the changes in our spiritual orientation. And again, we'll touch further on that as we go on, if we have time. So in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, it says, Jehovah God drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim and the flame of a sword that turned itself to keep the way of the tree of lives. So that original tree was to be protected. It was a sacred tree. And Swedenborg's explanation of that verse was that people are no longer able to communicate with heaven the way that the earliest heavenly people had. Circumstances in the earliest people communicate internally with heaven and through heaven with the Lord God. They love the Lord, and people who love the Lord are like angels, the only difference being that they are clothed in a body. Their deeper levels were open, offering unhindered access all the way to the Lord. These new descendants, however, were different. Those people believed in, rather than loved, the Lord, and it was their faith, not their love, which led them to be charitable towards their fellow humans. They could engage in external communication, but no longer in internal communication as the earliest people had. So with the change of attitude and a change of approach and a change of focus came also change of function within them. All right, so now we have this idea of temenos. So if you're going to protect something, you could use a sword to defend it, or you could build a fence around it, right? And so this became popular at a certain time to look at sacred enclosures, so that what's inside the enclosure is a sacred something. What's outside the enclosure is is ordinary life, or things that might threaten it, sort of profane things. So we have the word temenos, the Greek word temenos. Temno means I cut. And you can see that this prayer rug that's depicted here has got a border around it. And in fact, just about all prayer rugs that I've ever seen have got a border around it like that, a sort of an outline, if you like, or a picture frame, you might call it, for a carpet. It's to depict that sort of sense that if you're praying on this mat and being mindful of God or Allah, then you're to keep things from ordinary life out. You know, this is a special activity. In fact, most creation myths, interestingly enough, are often about separating, making distinctions. So, for example, distinguishing light from darkness, distinguishing what's above from what's below, distinguishing, certain kinds of animals from others. And so on. It's a lot about making distinctions, and it's kind of a lesson for us to be clear about making distinctions and keeping things in a certain hierarchy and relationship, so that we don't mix up what is ordinary with what is sacred. Otherwise, we lose focus on some essential things. So, what's a temenos? Is an enclosure. Sometimes the temenos is, as a fence, can keep things out because it could be dangerous. And sometimes it's to keep things in. This is almost a picture of me in my youth. I spent a lot of time in a playpen until the age of 3, I think, just to keep my parents happy that I wasn't going to run around and cray on the walls as I did once when I was allowed out. So we've got the idea of a temenos for a worship tent. This is a sacred enclosure made from tent materials, because in the early days people lived in tents, worshipped in tents, and tents were sacred things. And this is actually, in particular, the tent that contains the Ark of the Covenant, which contains the Ten Commandments. Church, the Jewish church. So the Ten Commandments went inside the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant with the two angels on it in gold, which they carried around when they were traveling, was placed whenever they camped inside this tent and its enclosure, and that was called the tabernacle. So you've got the commandments, the ark, and the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was very specifically designed to embody, if you like, teachings that were important in the religion for the spiritual life of the Hebrews. And later on, this model of design was the basis also for the temple, say the Temple of Jerusalem specifically, for example. So you've got that same sort of design carried through with the same. All the artifacts have a significance, and they're all related to correspondences as well. So they have spiritual meaning, and that spiritual meaning is important. So here we have a sacred enclosure around one of the oldest pyramids, the step pyramid at Saqqara. That was built for King Josa. It was about 2600 BC. It was designed and built by his vizier, or his chief administrator, Imhotep. Imhotep was a very, very switched on person who had an interest in many different things, and architecture and design of how to depict a teaching in a monument was one of his fortes. So this enclosure actually had some false entries. The real entrance is there where you see the sort of white line on the right of the picture going towards the rectangle. That's where the real entrance is, but there are many entrances tucked away in that perimeter wall, which look like entrances. They look like doorways, passageways, but when you get up close, you can't actually enter through them. So they're false doorways. And what's going on there? That's a way of sort of protecting and fooling people who don't know. It's kind of saying, hey, if you're not initiated into this, you've got to have some knowledge, right? And if you have some knowledge, you can find your way in. But if you don't have that knowledge, you're going to be fooled and kept away, because there'll be many who will try to gain entry into this sacred enclosure who aren't permitted to, and they're just not ready. And so it's a kind of protection. Here's another form of temenos, the ditch around Stonehenge. And of course there was a Woodhenge as well before Stonehenge. And the ditch is a kind of keeping things sacred inside and separate outside. Here's another one that I visited back in the 1980s at Mount Athos, the Serbian monastery Hilander. So you've got the church itself, which is considered to be the most sacred symbol in that whole community or monastery. It is in the centre, and it's surrounded by the buildings that sort of form a protective border around it, and there's a space within it. Now, it had also functional reasons that often these communities would be assailed by pirates and all sorts of people who would come and want to plunder their valuables and their relics and so on, or disturb their lifestyle. So it had a functional purpose as well, but essentially the design was based on a spiritual principle. So why do we have a separation between things, and what things in particular? Why do we need separation? Why isn't everything the same? And why isn't everything sacred? You might well ask. Well, we have to start with the world around us. When we look around, we have the world around us, and there are certain things we can come to know by looking around and studying the nature around us very closely. We can study the form of things, we can study the behavior of things, we can study the patterns in things. So we can see that something is a rock as opposed to a tree, or a tree as opposed to an animal. We even can come down to the level these days of elements, atoms, gases, liquids, rocks, solids, and so on. Processes, we've even worked out how photosynthesis work, weather patterns. We can even predict them, I don't know how accurately, but we can do better than just a wild guess. Even the precession of the equinoxes is known, which takes place over a period of 26,000 years. That's a very slow process, and it's been figured out. So there's a lot of things we can deduce from studying the world closely and keeping records, comparing notes, seeing how one thing is distinguished from another and how things behave. We can see laws and patterns of behavior, patterns of processes, patterns in forms, out of which, of course, comes physics, chemistry, and also mathematics, which is a more symbolic description of what we find in the world. What are the things that we cannot extract from nature? We might be able to study the forms, processes, and what things are made of, but we can't deduce from nature by looking at it without any references, external references. Who designed it? Who designed everything? Who made everything? Who maintains everything? If there is such a who. Why it exists, why things exist. So the end or the goal or the purpose, the meaning. We might be able to deduce what its use is locally, a local use, So a tree provides shade and food and shelter for birds and animals. But we can't take it to its ultimate. Who or what is it for? What is it for? Why are there things at all? Why are there particular things? And we can even apply that, of course, to us, life, mind, etc., consciousness. We can't extract from nature why it was designed the way it was, apart from the historical analysis, which is fairly limited. We can study forms, laws, and patterns. We've been able to detect what the likely unfolding of the historical order was, way down to the Big Bang, which is a very short time after the initial, or part of the initial creation. But there are limits to that. So why things exist, its purpose and meaning. Invisible realities and their influences. So we can't deduce those purely from an external study and logical deduction. So what do we need for that? Also, how we should act. That's another question that arises, that nature is not going to tell us Nature's not going to tell us whether to cut down that tree and burn the wood, or to hang on to it and make it grow, or whatever. There are no instructions written on the tree that tell us, except that if we eat from the tree and we die, then we know it's not good for us. That's certainly an instruction on how to act, but on the broader scale, there's very little available that tells us that in nature itself. What we should do, how to behave and respond. And the ultimate question there is, what saves me from myself as being cut off from God? So in a way, if we only regard nature as a thing in itself, and that's the final and only thing that exists, then we are cut off from anything that might actually have a chance of telling us those questions. So without this knowledge that we cannot deduce from nature, we only have an incomplete or partial picture of reality. So without this knowledge, we do make guesses, of course, things like, nature or the universe, as we give it a name, designs itself, or we might say evolution, or drives, such as reproduction and fitness to survive, are what maintains it. It might have been designed by aliens for all we know, or there may be nothing at all that's designed it, and it just sort of it's in a never-ending loop of existence. And of course, being cut off from a source does come with a high cost, which is the profound fear of death, the profound fear of our own annihilation. There's a wonderful book about the denial of death, which is worth reading. So, we have, for example, as examples of what we just talked about, the James Webb Space Telescope, which was launched Christmas Day in 2021, 2 years ago, at the cost of $10 billion, which in Australian dollars is about 15 billion, which is 9 zeros. Why do they launch it? Why do they build it? Why do they have such a huge, costly project? Well, mainly it's curiosity. We love to know. But can we know what we're seeking to know without that cost? NASA space exploration and the James Webb Telescope are expected to revolutionize our understanding of the cosmos. It'll help determine whether planets orbiting other stars could support life. So this is their own justification for the cost and the project. They say it will observations will give us a simple, clear picture of the early universe, and therefore the origins of life, which means our origin as well, hopefully. But in practical terms, it creates a huge boost to the economy, of course, to business. So in general, science looks at, why are we here, of course, and it's looking at all life, therefore also humans, as saying that we've evolved an inbuilt sense of purpose or aim to survive and procreate. That seems to be all they're interested in having us do, or seeing us do. This is supported by secular humanism, whose god is Charles Darwin. Secular humanism is kind of, be kind to others kind of idea. We evolved from their most likely recent common ancestor, Homo erectus. And in the beginning, of course, there was nothing, and then suddenly, bang, and time and matter began to exist 14 billion years ago. Where did life come from? The origin is sought historically. not in the unseen, non-empirical realms. Questions like, what is consciousness? Well, without revelation, we often confuse consciousness with simple awareness, or awake, simply being awake, or being sensitive to feelings. Questions like, what is free will? Well, again, without revelation, we don't see that free will is for a purpose, specific purpose. And without revelation, we tend to confuse the mind, which are spiritual faculties in us, with the brain, which are bodily organs that carry out those spiritual functions in the world. Again, without revelation, it's very difficult to measure the value of something, to assess the value of anything, and therefore all importance or significance or value is measured quantitatively, pretty much. So saying, for example, that the sun is insignificant because it's only one in approximately 200 billion trillion stars in the universe. Or saying things like the earth is insignificant because as the astronomy educator Carl Sagan put it in his Pale Blue Dot speech, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived here on this mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Our planet is a lonely speck in a great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there's no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. So preserve and cherish the pale blue dot. So, in that same vein, it's considered that in the whole scheme of things, humans are insignificant, and that's a sort of form of nihilism. But nothing matters, and your entire existence is meaningless and futile when compared with the size, scale, quantity, and power of everything else in the universe. In other words, you're insignificant because you're only one person out of 8 billion, which is 8 and 9 zeros after it, who are that's just the people alive right now in 2023. And out of the 117 billion across all of time, and that's just on this planet. Okay, let's keep an eye on the time. So we've had people who are specialists in consciousness who say, who try to define it as just the state of sensations or feelings or awareness which begin in the morning when you wake up from dreamless sleep and continue through the day until you fall into a coma or die or fall asleep again. And this is one of the world's experts on consciousness. It's confusing everything together in the same definition. And the guy who was running that particular seminar, which I had a look at, Axel Clearemans from Belgium, he is the expert in the science field anyway, and science. And he says, well, what is consciousness? And he says nobody actually really knows. What he means is that he doesn't.
That's right. Yes, he doesn't. Yeah.
So anyway, the question is, well, who is God? And there are major religions say a lot about God, saying that he's transcendent, above and beyond anything that exists in the world, omnipotent, omniscient, beneficent. Now, there's a lot of qualities of God. Will honour. So God is according to Swedenborg and other sources, religious sources like ancient Egyptians, for example, is that the world was created for a purpose. And that originally people were in tune with the instruction about that purpose, and therefore an instruction about what they should do in order to live a useful, productive and fulfilling life. And the illustrations for those people, reminders for those people, was simply looking at nature, looking at themselves, looking around themselves, and through those things they would see the meaning, because the meaning was sewn into the forms and processes, structures and behaviours of things around them. So nature is still like that, but we've lost sight of what it means. So the earliest people were participatively engaged with nature. Until that Garden of Eden departure, when people started to become more outwardly focused, outwardly oriented, and so that the access to that language was lost. And it was kept in terms of symbols. So correspondences were the original reminders. So correspondences is outer forms and functions and processes which reveal inner spiritual design principles of how reality operates in the spiritual world. When that became lost, all we had left was symbols that reminded us of it, which are representations. So they're kind of second-hand reminders. And that's what Swedenborg calls the most ancient church, were people who'd lost their direct relationship with correspondences from a personal internal instruction to having to remind themselves of it through groups that kept it alive, and maybe sometimes expressed it in the form of, say, the Venus of Willendorf or hieroglyphs and so on. But hieroglyphs are already a sort of third layer of reminders that no longer did they have pictorial representations, although hieroglyphs are still pictorial, but later writing developed into a representation of the sounds which carried the words, which carried the meanings, which linked us back as reminders of the meanings themselves, or the things themselves. So the concepts and so on. Even spiritual concepts. So sacred writings then became third-hand reminders. So some of these writings talked about the things that were important to them in the early day. So that's what we have with correspondences, as above, so below.
Right.
So let me just, I'll just read one comment about what correspondences are. Then I'll look at two pictures of some buildings in the world which carry that meaning, the correspondential meaning, as a way of conveying it to future people, because sacred writings in themselves don't do it justice. And what is that thing that we're talking about? Okay. So this is from Dr. Philip Groves in his book Quest for Integration, Volume 2. He says that Swedenborg said in his work, The Coronas, that correspondences by which the word had been written, so that's the sacred Bible, had been written, possess such force and strength that it may be called the force and strength of divine omnipotence. Omnipotence is all power. For through these correspondences, the natural acts conjointly with the spiritual, and the spiritual with the natural, thus everything of heaven with everything of the world. So that's from Swedenborg. And Dr. Groves explains this by saying that correspondences are living relationships that connect God with the celestial, and the celestial with the spiritual, and the spiritual with the natural worlds. They're not mere symbols which simply suggest a meaning. They are powerful cosmic devices which relay force, meaning, substance, and value to the one who appreciates their significance. Correspondences are the means of bringing the separate, discontinuous worlds into functional unity and harmony. And when taken into ourselves, they can lead to the integration of our several levels and functions into one life that becomes the end effect of creation. So correspondences have quite an important place. Let me cut to the chase here. One building. Now, what is sacred is that which actually restores our connection with that tree of life in the Garden of Eden. In other words, what is the principal way in which we can live that allows us to fulfill the purpose for which all of this exists, all of this that we're surrounded by in our life. And that purpose is said to be the creation of a heavenly community of highly capable beings who work together, that's derived from people that have lived on Earth or lived on in this natural world on one planet or another. So that's what Swedenborg says is what he was told is the purpose of all creation, to create a heavenly community from the human race. And so what that requires is for us to gain the knowledge of what to do and how to be and how to relate to this world, to each other, to ourselves, to our possibilities, to our God, and so on. Now this pyramid, the Great Pyramid in Giza, is said to by many people to just be a tomb. It's it used to be filled with a body that died in a sarcophagus with whatever around it, and it's been robbed since, and therefore there's nothing in there now. I beg to differ with them, because I can see that the process that Swedenborg describes of our own regeneration, rebirth, which consists of first taking in some instructions, then beginning to work with those instructions in an active way, and then becoming regenerated as a result of applying those instructions, is what fulfills us in our potential state. So if you looked at this pyramid in terms of a vertical degree of being, if you like, quality of being or fulfillment of potentials, spiritual potentials, then the highest chamber would be the thing to strive for. It's also the most arduous journey, because it's the most uphill place to get to. There is a possibility of gaining knowledge, and then after that knowledge has been gained, not bothering to apply it to myself any further, but to simply relish and treasure the value of that knowledge, and to take pleasure in that, which some people do, and that's fine. That's what I would say is the flatlining about halfway up the incline, and leveling out to go to what's called the quench chamber. It's only called the quench chamber because nobody really knows what is there. I would say that's the spiritual level of dwelling, whereas the highest, the king's chamber as it's called, is the celestial. Not only because the king's chamber is higher, but also because it is over the center line. So if you consider the center line sort of being balanced between what you know and what you do with it, then if you do something with it that's substantial, you actually come over that line of just sitting on the knowledge, or considering that the knowledge is enough. And of course you have the bottom there, underneath the pyramid is this subterranean chamber, which has a very higgledy-piggledy form. It has a very higgledy-piggledy couple of ways to get there. and it is the path of least effort. So if you did very little apart from just letting yourself trundle downhill, you would end up there. And it did have water in it as well, so it's not a pleasant place to be. There's nothing that suggests that that was built after the pyramid at all, so or that it was even a mistake, because why would you bother tunneling so deeply, so accurately, and placing it dead center underneath the Queen's chamber if it was a design accident? So all of these things to me suggest that there is a purpose in this monument, and it is to depict the teachings. Now I'm going to pick one more, and then we'll call it quits. Let's have a look at this. Now we've got the Gothic cathedral builders took a very heavy building, which was the Romanesque form of the cathedral, which required a lot of stone substance to uphold the roof, because the heaviness was all in the material that was up above over the roof of the cathedral that had to be supported. So the higher the church went, the more material, and the wider the church was, the more material would have to be supported, and the columns would have to be fatter and fatter and fatter to sustain that force. Well, there was a time in the Middle Ages when a brilliant set of minds who were interested in this kind of sacred knowledge actually came up with a method of building much thinner walls, and because the walls distributed the forces in a new way, which was called the pointed arch, and it brought the stresses to the outside of the building through flying buttresses, as they're called. So they're sort of little walls that are built outside the cathedral wall. It allowed the walls to thin out, and therefore some of the space could be relieved from being load-bearing and be opened up with glass, and which they coloured, and the stained glass could be used to depict the Bible stories. So these sacred stories were given back to the people, because before that time the clergy often said, you can't read the Bible, you know, you have to come to us in order to learn what it says, and we'll tell you what to do with it because we know best.
That's right.
Quite a troublesome process. And so these cathedral builders were very interested in giving the stories back to the masses, many of whom couldn't even read. So having it pictorially displayed in all its glory in colourful glass in such a high, lofty building that gave you a feeling of humility when you walked in was a wonderful statement of the teachings that they were trying to convey. So there's a lot more to be said, of course, and I've only just covered a very small area. Another symbol is the Taj Mahal, which I visited recently. But let's see, what can we say about it in a very short time? The Taj Mahal is a layout of a doctrine. It's not just a pretty monument with a nice garden. The Taj Mahal itself represents the presence of the Lord God in the soul, and that can only be attained by going through this garden, which is in front of it. You see the garden there with the lotus pool? The garden has 4 rivers coming from a central fountain, which represents the Garden of Eden. And the meaning of the Garden of Eden is an orientation of our knowledge and intelligence which flows from the Lord God towards us, and the way in which we take that, the way we deal with that, and what we do with it, it determines the orientation that we end up with. So the idea is that there is a more external use of that knowledge, but there is a more internal use, and the more internal use is the channel or the river that comes from this single source, that's the one that flows towards the Taj Mahal itself. So it's a representation of the Garden of Eden. That's also used in Muslim doctrine, by the way. it's not exclusively Christian. And then, of course, to enter that garden, which is the formation of the mind from an external mind into a spiritual and then celestial mind, the area before it, before you come through that grand gate, the main entrance, is the forecourt, is the abode of our outer thinking, and then you have the Taj Ganj, which is the marketplace in front of that, which is external life. So there is a sort of to that layout. It's kind of like the human form, if you like. How our feet are the most external; they get the dirtiest as we're walking around. They give us direction, a very broad external direction. We have a middle part which is more spiritual, and then we have a higher part which is more celestial. And so this whole layout of the Taj Mahal kind of represents that. So the Taj Mahal proper, the mausoleum as it's called, is represents God's dwelling place. It's the perfected state. And you have this same sort of representation in ancient garden carpets. So this is a Isfahan garden carpet from a very old one. And another one, it has that same sort of division into four because it represents the Garden of Eden. So when you're praying, it's intended to remind you of the doctrines. It's also expressed in other places like the Alhambra, which was built by Sufi influences in Spain. Very beautiful place. So the doctrines are kept alive by embodying them or embedding them in architecture and art. As you could see with Botticelli, as you could see with the pyramids, the Sphinx, other architecture here, like the suggestion on the left in Italy, in Florence, that we have three sort of phases, each of which we begin out quite rough, and it becomes more and more smooth as we work our way towards the celestial, or as the celestial works on us. So we definitely need revealed teachings. They are what make it sacred. We cannot deduce them from nature, and therefore we have to protect what we have got from that so that we can make use of it. And a lot of it is, according to Swedenborg, in the New Jerusalem teachings, which is Revelations, Book of Revelation, chapter 21, 22. And there's plenty of explanation in Swedenborg's writings about how to see that and how to deal with that in our inner lives and how to apply it. So that's it from me, pretty much. It's probably a good time to ask if there's any questions, if we still have time for that. I think on the whole, I would sum up the opportunity that's before us here and the way in which I would use the interpretation of the teachings of the New Jerusalem, which is a heavenly city that represents the teachings, is this. I would say that I am a place in which the presence of God can come alive in me as a new mind and a new heart, from which I can then live that understanding intelligibly expressed. So I'm going to leave you with that.
Thank you, Joe. Are there any questions?
Yeah, thanks very much. I'd like to know the name of that lofty cathedral. The one where you talked about the flying buttresses. Where is it and what's it called?
Well, you can look at any of the early Gothic cathedrals, such as Chartres Cathedral, Notre Dame, Reims.
Which was that particular one?
Oh, that particular one? I didn't make a note, actually, of which one it was. But, I can show you others. So we've got the same sort of idea, because it didn't show the flying buttresses in that picture, but here is, this is Notre Dame in Paris.
Wow. Yeah.
Which is one of the biggest, earliest ones. You can see how there's sort of structures that fly out from the walls that take the stresses because what happens is if you have a heavy roof on a thin wall, the wall tends to buckle out because it wants to bring that force down to earth.
Yeah.
And this is a way to counteract that. And you've got the same situation in Chartres Cathedral.
Yeah.
One question I often ask people is, why do you think that the towers are different? Left and the right tower are different. So I'm not going to answer that in this talk, but I've addressed that in the past. So.
Well, what's the answer? Come on, we want to know now.
I think John also had a question.
I'm not sure if this qualifies as a question or a comment, but my own first experience of the sacred came about in actually a Romanesque cathedral with the big heavy round arches and the big and the big fat columns, and all slightly crooked and leaning, built back in the 11th century by the Normans in Ely. And they were it was sort of semi-darkness, and they were singing evensong in Latin. And I very much went into an altered state of mind. After some time, my dad asked me, John, are you thinking of renouncing Zen Buddhism for Anglicanism? And I said, Dad, that's a completely irrelevant suggestion, which indeed it was. A couple of other things. I mean, I have often associated the sacred with specific places. One of the most sacred places that I have ever experienced was a tiny little anteroom with nothing in it but a candle and a tape loop in Auschwitz concentration camp. On the tape loop was a Jewish prayer for forgiveness, and there was a button on the wall that made the tape loop operate, and we pressed that button I don't know how many times, and I think we sat and meditated there for, I don't know, maybe an hour. It was one of the deepest experiences of my life. I guess another one was just a few days ago. We went and saw the big picture in Broken Hill. And again, I feel that what was brought forth with probably not even any intention on the part of those who devised the big picture, who I take to be quite secular, was a sense of the sacred, of the divine, of what the anthroposophists call the ground of being, the transcendent or subscendent, which is above and below everything. And finally, a comment on the Great Pyramid. I have seen analysis that suggests almost a literal upside down, that the bottommost chamber was the most profound, the deepest, but so deep that mere mortals could not stand it.
Yeah, thanks, John. Of course, what your experience is instructive in that it's often not necessarily the place which is in itself sacred, and this is what people often don't consider. Is it's not it's what the person is experiencing and gets from it that makes all the difference. You can get, Wilson Van Dusen, Dr. Wilson Van Dusen used to carry around this icon, which was a 2-cent icon. It was a very cheap, cheap form of iconography from the Russians Orthodox Church, and he said that gave him more spiritual insights and joys than anything that would have been a lot more expensive. So it's not the thing per se, but the orientation to it and what you gain from it. That's really the point, I think, of this talk, really. So, yeah.
Well, it's past 9 o'clock. I wonder if there's any final comments or questions anyone wants to make before we finish off for the evening.
This is Louis. Yeah, I'd like to ask. Thanks, first of all, Joe. I thought that was really interesting. I'm curious about Riley Lee and his shakuhachi. So, did you say that he performed at the Swedenborg Church? And I wonder what he thought about if he heard any of the Swedenborg teachings. What he thought about them.
Well, he's a very open-minded man, but you know, we haven't gone into much depth because most of the time when he comes, we're usually organising the sound quality and you know all sorts of logistics. But I know him to be a very spiritual man because the things that he says about his music are telling me a lot, and I'd say that you know, if I'm a Swedenborgian, I would hope that I would take Swedenborg as seriously as he takes the tradition of that he was taught of the Buddhist priest playing the shakuhachi flute. You know, he's a very good model for for taking it seriously and seeing. In essence, you can find all the spiritual principles in many different traditions. It doesn't have to be per se Swedenborg, but Swedenborg does add a lot of value and detail to what we can know. That helps us to orient ourselves rightly towards our duty and spiritual journey.